The night the legend felt smallest, no cameras were there to see it. That was the secret no one told the crowds who screamed his name. They believed legends were built from thunder, spotlights, roaring stages, and songs that refused to die. They never imagined that somewhere between the applause and the encore, there could exist a silence heavy enough to bend a man's shoulders, a silence that followed him home, a silence that sat beside him at the edge of the bed long after the music stopped. And on one of those nights, when the house was too large and the corridors too quiet, a little girl watched her father not as the world's idol, but as a man who looked strangely alone inside his own empire. Lisa Marie never understood the way strangers spoke about him. To them, he was a phenomenon, a king, a myth that belonged to history. To her, he was simply the person who would sometimes sit on the floor instead of the couch, as if the weight of the crown made soft things uncomfortable. She would notice the small details no headline could ever capture, the way his laugh arrived a moment late, the way his eyes searched rooms even when nothing was missing, the way he stayed awake long after everyone else had fallen asleep. The world saw a legend rising. She saw something being spent. The house itself felt like it knew the difference. During the day, it buzzed with movement, phones ringing, footsteps rushing, conversations echoing off polished walls. But at night, the rooms grew watchful. Portraits seemed less like decorations and more like witnesses. They captured moments of glory, frozen forever in perfect light, while the present moved forward, imperfect and quiet. Lisa Marie would sometimes pause in the hallway and look up at those framed triumphs, wondering why victory looked so permanent on paper, yet so fragile in real life. Her father had built something enormous, so enormous it no longer fit inside ordinary life. It started long before she could understand it. The tours, the lights, the endless expectations. Every performance wasn't just a show. It was a promise that the legend would never falter, never fade, never become human in the eyes of those who needed him to be more than that. People didn't come to see a man. They came to see certainty. They came to see immortality dressed in a white suit, singing as if time itself could be persuaded to stop. But time never stops. It only waits in the shadows until the music fades. There were nights when he would sit alone in a room that was too beautifully arranged to feel real. The trophies gleamed, the awards shone, yet his gaze would drift past them as though they belonged to someone else, someone stronger, someone tireless, someone who never felt the weight of carrying an entire myth on his shoulders. Lisa Marie would sometimes stand in the doorway, unseen, sensing something she didn't yet have words for, that greatness, when it grows too large, can quietly begin to consume the person who created it. He never spoke about the cost, not directly. Instead, he performed it. Every smile on stage felt flawless, every note precise, every gesture confident. He gave the audience exactly what they believed he was: unstoppable, radiant, larger than life, and they loved him for it. They loved him so much that they never wondered what it took to remain that way. They didn't see the hours of stillness between shows, the long stretches of quiet when he seemed to be listening for something only he could hear. They didn't see the moments when the crown slipped slightly, not enough to fall, but enough to reveal the tired man beneath. Lisa Marie began to notice patterns. After every triumph, there was a pause. After every standing ovation, there was a silence. After every declaration that he was the greatest, there was a distant look in his eyes, as if greatness itself was asking him for another piece of himself in return. She didn't fear the crowds. She feared the quiet that followed them. One evening, after a particularly thunderous performance, the house was filled with celebration. People laughed loudly, glasses clinked, compliments flowed endlessly. Everywhere she looked, adults spoke about him as though he were invincible, as though the story had already been written and guaranteed a glorious ending. Yet when the party thinned and the laughter moved to other rooms, she saw him standing alone near a window, staring out into the dark like someone searching for a version of himself that had been left behind somewhere far away. He sensed her presence before she spoke. "You should be asleep," he said softly, without turning. She stepped closer, small footsteps barely making a sound on the polished floor. "Everyone says you're the greatest." He finally turned then, and for a brief moment the legend disappeared completely. What remained was just her father, tired, thoughtful, and strangely unsure of what to say next.
"Sometimes," he replied, choosing his words carefully, "being the greatest just means people expect you never to be anything else." She didn't fully understand the meaning, but she understood the feeling. Expectations were invisible things, yet they seemed to fill the room more than any furniture or decoration ever could. They pressed against the walls. They lingered in the air. They followed him everywhere, even into moments meant to be quiet and ordinary. As the years passed, the legend grew brighter. The world repeated his name like a sacred phrase, convinced that such brilliance could never dim. Yet Lisa Marie watched the subtle trade being made every day. For every song that lived forever, a piece of normal life disappeared. For every standing ovation, another ordinary moment slipped away unnoticed. The myth expanded outward, magnificent and unstoppable, while the man at its center seemed to grow more distant from the simple joys that once came easily. She began to wonder a question no fan would ever ask. What happens when the legend becomes too big for the man who built it? The answer did not arrive all at once. It revealed itself slowly, in quiet pauses, in unfinished conversations, in the way he sometimes looked at old photographs as though they belonged to someone he used to know, rather than someone he still was. Success kept building higher walls around him, each achievement another brick sealing the legend permanently in place. And legends, she realized, do not get to step outside and rest. They must remain exactly as the world remembers them, forever shining, forever certain, forever strong. But people are not made to live forever as symbols. One night, much later, she would recall that moment by the window and finally understand its true meaning. The crown had never been just an honor. It had been a responsibility so heavy it could not be removed without everything collapsing. He had built a legend that would outlive him, outshine him, outgrow him, and in doing so, he had quietly signed an agreement with history. The world would keep the king, but the man would slowly be asked to give pieces of himself away to keep that crown from ever slipping. The audience never saw the exchange. They only saw the brilliance. Lisa Marie saw the cost beginning to collect. The house had begun to learn his moods. It reacted before people did. When he entered after a performance, the air seemed to shift first, subtle, almost invisible. Conversation softened, movement slowed. Even laughter lowered itself as if instinctively aware that the brightness he carried on stage did not always travel back home with him. Lisa Marie noticed these changes long before she could explain them. She would watch how adults became careful around him, not out of fear, but out of reverence. They treated him like something fragile wrapped inside greatness, something that must never be disturbed too abruptly. It confused her. How could the man who commanded thousands with a single note require such careful silence in his own living room? She began to understand that power and vulnerability sometimes live in the same body, and that the world often worships one while ignoring the other. There were evenings when he tried to be ordinary. He would sit with her, ask about small things, listen as if those small things mattered more than the roaring crowds outside their gates. In those moments, the legend stepped aside, and a father took his place. He would smile easily then, laugh without delay, speak without the measured weight he carried in public. Those were the rare, unguarded hours when she felt he truly belonged to her and not to history. But the spell never lasted long. Phone calls would arrive. Plans would change. The outside world would knock, demanding the king back from the man. And each time she saw the shift happen again, the quiet adjustment of posture, the careful rebuilding of the persona, the invisible crown settling back into place, he would become who they needed him to be, even if it meant leaving the softer version of himself behind in the room they had just shared. She never resented the world for loving him. She resented the way that love never seemed to let him rest. One night, long after midnight, she wandered into a hallway where the lights were dimmed to a soft glow. She heard music playing somewhere, low, almost hesitant. Following the sound, she found him sitting alone at the piano. He wasn't performing. He wasn't rehearsing. He was simply pressing keys slowly, as if searching for a melody that refused to fully reveal itself. He didn't notice her at first. Each note lingered in the air longer than it should have, echoing through the empty room like a question waiting for an answer. The music didn't sound triumphant or polished. It sounded unfinished, uncertain, human. She stood quietly in the doorway, sensing that this was not a moment meant for applause, only for understanding.
When he finally looked up, he didn't seem surprised to see her, almost as if some part of him had known she would come. "Can't sleep?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "You don't sound like you do on stage." A faint smile touched his face, but it carried more truth than humor. "On stage," he said softly, "they hear what they need to hear." "And here?" she asked. He paused before answering, fingers resting on the keys without pressing them. "Here," he replied, "I try to hear what I actually feel."
The silence that followed felt heavier than any applause she had ever heard. She stepped closer, climbing onto the bench beside him. The piano keys reflected dim light, their surface smooth and cold. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The house listened. The night listened. It felt as though even time slowed down, curious about what would be said next. "Do you like being that big?" she asked finally, struggling to find words that could hold the size of his fame. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he played a soft chord that hung in the air, unresolved. Then he exhaled slowly. "Being big means a lot of people believe in you," he said carefully, "and that's a beautiful thing." She waited. She sensed there was more. "But," he added after a moment, voice quieter now, "it also means they believe you can never fall." The words stayed in the room long after he stopped speaking. For the first time, she saw the hidden tension behind the legend. Not fear of failure, but fear of disappointing a world that had built him into something almost superhuman. She realized that every performance wasn't just about singing. It was about protecting an image that millions depended on, an image that left no room for weakness, doubt, or exhaustion. And protecting that image was slowly costing him pieces of himself. As the years moved forward, the pattern deepened. Success arrived in waves: larger tours, louder crowds, greater expectations. Each victory was celebrated publicly, yet privately it seemed to demand another silent adjustment from him. He slept less, he thought more, he smiled often, but the smile sometimes carried an effort that only those closest to him could detect. Lisa Marie began to notice something unsettling. The legend never aged, but the man did. On posters and television screens, he looked timeless, untouchable, eternal. But in the quiet spaces between public appearances, she saw fatigue settling into his eyes, heard pauses growing longer in his speech, felt the invisible distance stretching between who he truly was and who the world insisted he remain. It frightened her, not suddenly, but gradually, like watching a shadow lengthen across the floor without realizing when it began. One afternoon, she overheard adults discussing his schedule in another room. Their voices were practical, efficient, focused on logistics and expectations. Dates, cities, appearances, commitments. The list sounded endless, necessary, unavoidable. She understood then that the legend was no longer something he simply created. It was something he now had to continuously feed. And legends are always hungry. That night, she lay awake thinking about the piano music she had heard, the hesitant notes, the unfinished melody. It struck her that perhaps the truest version of him was not the world that adored, but the one who sat alone in dim light, trying to listen to his own feelings without an audience to guide the tune. A quiet realization settled over her, unsettling and profound. If the legend kept growing, the man inside it might one day struggle to breathe. The thought refused to leave her, because deep down she sensed that the story everyone celebrated, the rise of an unstoppable icon, was only half the truth. The other half was unfolding in silence, behind closed doors, in rooms that remembered every note he played when no one else was listening. And somewhere within that silence, a question had begun to form, one that would not be answered anytime soon. What happens when the world refuses to let a legend end, even when the man who built it desperately needs a beginning again? Fame has a strange way of freezing time for the world while letting it move forward for the person living inside it. To millions, he remained exactly who he had always been, timeless, electrifying, untouchable. Old performances replayed like sacred rituals. Old songs sounded as fresh as the day they were first sung. The legend existed in a loop where perfection never aged, never cracked, never slowed. But inside the private hours of real life, time continued its quiet work, unnoticed by the crowds, yet deeply felt by the man they believed would never change. Lisa Marie began to see that contradiction more clearly as she grew older. The house, once filled with playful curiosity, now felt heavier with awareness. She no longer wandered through hallways wondering what fame meant. She now watched carefully, reading expressions, noticing silences, understanding that behind every grand success, there often followed an equally grand exhaustion. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like a candle burning brightly while slowly shortening with every moment it gave light. She saw how expectations had stopped being requests and had become assumptions. People didn't ask if he could perform. They assumed he always would. They didn't wonder if he felt tired. They believed he was immune to it. They didn't consider whether he needed time to simply exist as a father, a man, a human being separate from the myth. To them, the legend was permanent, and if the legend was permanent, then so too must be the strength that sustained it. But strength, she realized, is not endless. It is spent, little by little, even when no one notices the cost. There were moments when he would try to reclaim something simple, watching television without sound, sitting quietly by a window, or just talking about memories that had nothing to do with music or crowds. In those moments, he seemed almost relieved, like someone briefly stepping out of armor that had been worn too long. Yet even those small escapes were fragile. A phone call, a reminder, a commitment would arrive, and the armor would return, polished and ready, leaving the softer self hidden again beneath its shine. One afternoon, she found him looking through old photographs spread across a large table. They showed different eras of his life, early performances, candid backstage smiles, moments of pure youthful confidence when the future had still been an open road instead of a fixed path. His fingers traced the edges of the images as though they were relics from a life that belonged to someone else. "You look happier there," she said gently, surprising herself with the honesty of the observation. He studied one particular photograph longer than the others before responding. "I was lighter," he admitted. "Back then I was still becoming something. I didn't know yet what it would ask for me." The answer lingered between them, heavy with meaning. She realized then that success does not just give, it also decides. It shapes schedules, relationships, expectations, even identity itself. The more the world defined him as a legend, the harder it became for him to simply redefine himself as anything else. Growth for most people meant evolving freely. For him, growth meant staying exactly who the world believed he had always been. And that kind of stillness can become a prison disguised as admiration. As public admiration grew louder, private solitude deepened. Crowds adored him with unwavering devotion, yet devotion from afar cannot replace quiet companionship up close. The louder the cheers became, the more noticeable the silence felt when they ended. It was in those silent hours that the truth of the cost revealed itself most clearly, not through complaints or confessions, but through pauses, distant looks, and the sense that something essential was being slowly negotiated away to keep the legend alive. Lisa Marie began to feel protective, though she could not fully explain why. She sensed that he was giving more than he ever received back, pouring energy, emotion, and identity into a creation that demanded constant maintenance. The world celebrated the result, but rarely questioned the toll. One evening, after another overwhelming wave of praise from outside, she noticed him sitting unusually still, hands clasped together, gaze unfocused. He wasn't sad in a visible way. He was reflective, as though weighing something invisible but important. "Do you ever wish you could just stop?" she asked carefully. He looked at her, surprised, not by the question itself, but by the courage it took to ask it. "Stop what?" he replied. "Stop being what everyone thinks you are," she said. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly, eyes drifting toward the ceiling as if searching for a safe place to put the truth. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried a quiet gravity. "If I stopped being that," he said, "a lot of people wouldn't know who I am anymore." The realization struck her deeply. The legend had grown so powerful that stepping away from it risked erasing not just expectations, but recognition itself. The world loved him, but it loved him in a specific form, unchanging, larger than life, eternally certain. To become smaller, quieter, more human, might mean becoming less visible to those who only understood him as an icon. And visibility, she realized, had become both his greatest gift and his quietest burden. From that day on, she watched more closely, sensing that the true struggle was not about fame itself, but about permanence. Legends are not allowed to evolve the way ordinary people do. They are preserved, repeated, remembered exactly as they were at their brightest.
Any change, any vulnerability, any sign of ordinary human limitation feels to the world like a betrayal of the myth they cherish. But to the person living inside that myth, refusing to change can feel like slowly disappearing. The tension between those two realities began to define everything. Publicly, the legend remained flawless, glowing as brightly as ever. Privately, the man continued negotiating with expectations that never paused long enough for him to fully rest. Each day required him to carry both identities simultaneously: the immortal figure the world adored, and the mortal human who still felt exhaustion, doubt, and longing for simplicity. Lisa Marie could sense that this balancing act could not last forever. Not because he lacked strength, but because even the strongest legends are built on human hearts, and human hearts, no matter how admired, still need quiet moments where they are allowed to beat without performing for anyone at all. By the time the world was convinced the legend would last forever, the man inside it had already begun to feel the strain of forever. It didn't happen loudly. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden announcement that something had changed. Instead, it revealed itself in subtle fractures, moments so small that anyone else might have ignored them. But Lisa Marie didn't ignore them. She had grown up watching the difference between applause and silence, and she knew that the most important truths never arrived with noise. They arrived quietly, and once seen, they could never be unseen. There were days when he seemed almost weightless, full of energy, smiling easily, joking with the same warmth that had first made the world fall in love with him. On those days, the legend and the man appeared perfectly aligned, as if the burden had magically disappeared. Those were the days everyone else believed defined him completely. But there were other days. Days when the house felt heavier before he even walked into the room. Days when conversations became shorter, pauses longer, and the air around him carried a tension no one dared to name. He was never unkind, never distant in a deliberate way, but something behind his eyes seemed to be constantly calculating, measuring expectations, managing pressure, deciding how much of himself could be given away without losing what little remained just for him. Lisa Marie began to recognize that look. It was the look of someone who could never truly clock out of being who the world believed he was. One evening, she overheard two adults speaking in hushed tones in another room. They weren't criticizing him, they were praising him, listing achievements, recalling sold-out shows, repeating the familiar narrative of greatness that followed him everywhere. Their admiration was genuine, but there was something else hidden inside their words, an assumption that he would always continue exactly as he had before, as if greatness had erased the possibility of limitation. She stood there longer than she should have, listening, until a quiet realization settled over her with uncomfortable clarity. The world didn't just love him, it depended on him staying the same. And that dependence left him no safe place to change. Later that night, she found him alone again, not at the piano this time, but sitting in a dimly lit room filled with memorabilia, awards, framed posters, photographs frozen in moments of triumph. The room felt less like a celebration and more like a reminder, a carefully preserved archive of who he had been at every shining peak. He was studying one of the older photographs, his expression unreadable. "Do you ever get tired of looking at all this?" she asked gently. He didn't turn right away. "Sometimes," he admitted. "It feels like they're all watching me, making sure I don't change too much." The answer unsettled her more than she expected. "Is that why you keep going?" she asked. "Because they're watching?" He finally looked at her, and for a brief second, the usual confidence faded completely, replaced by something far more honest. "I keep going," he said slowly, "because I don't know who I am if I stop." The words echoed in the quiet room like a confession disguised as a simple sentence. For the first time, she understood the real danger. Not failure, not criticism, not even exhaustion. The real danger was identity itself. When a person becomes a symbol for millions, stepping away doesn't just feel like rest. It feels like erasure, like stepping out of the spotlight and discovering that without it, the world no longer recognizes you. And perhaps worse, discovering you no longer recognize yourself. The legend had grown so large that it had begun to define the man completely. The songs, the performances, the image, they weren't just things he did anymore. They had become who he was, at least in the eyes of everyone else's private world. And when identity is tied to performance, rest can start to feel like loss instead of relief.
Lisa Marie felt a quiet fear rising inside her. Not panic, not dread, something slower and deeper. The sense that the story everyone believed was heading toward endless triumph might actually be moving toward something far more complicated. Because no one had ever asked what happens when a legend cannot stop being legendary, even when the person inside it is simply human. As the months passed, the pattern intensified. Publicly, everything remained brilliant. The praise never slowed, the admiration never weakened. If anything, it grew stronger, more devoted, more certain that the legend would endure unchanged forever. Privately, however, she began noticing the cost more clearly. He laughed less spontaneously. He paused more often before speaking. He seemed to carry invisible calculations into every decision, as if constantly weighing what the world expected against what he actually felt. The performances remained flawless, but afterward there was a deeper silence than before, a silence that lingered longer and pressed heavier against the walls of the house. One night, unable to sleep, she walked past his study and saw the light still on. Through the half-open door, she caught a glimpse of him sitting alone, not working, not rehearsing, just sitting, hands folded, eyes distant. He looked neither happy nor sad. He looked thoughtful in a way that suggested he was asking himself questions no one else could answer for him. She didn't enter the room. She simply watched for a moment, sensing instinctively that this was a private kind of battle, one fought not against critics or expectations, but against the quiet fear of losing oneself inside one's own creation. For the first time, a thought crossed her mind that she wished she could immediately forget. What if the legend he built to last forever was slowly costing him the ability to simply live in the present? The idea stayed with her, refusing to fade, because she was beginning to see the truth the world never would. The crown did not just shine, it pressed down, it demanded, it reminded him every day that millions believed he was unbreakable, and that belief left him no safe space to ever admit he might, someday, feel otherwise. And deep inside, she sensed that the story was moving toward a moment no one outside their quiet world was prepared to witness. A moment when the legend would still be shining brightly for everyone else, but the man beneath it would finally have to decide whether he could continue carrying the weight of forever, or whether forever itself had already begun to carry him away from the life he once knew. The world believed the story was simple. A boy with a voice became a legend. The legend became a king. And kings in stories either reign forever or fall dramatically. But real lives rarely follow dramatic scripts. Sometimes they end not with a crash, but with a quiet realization that changes everything. Lisa Marie understood this long before the world did. By the time the legend had reached its brightest, she had already seen enough of the silence behind it to know that greatness was never the full truth. She had watched the slow negotiations between who he was and who he was expected to be. She had seen the invisible weight of forever pressing gently, constantly, day after day. Yet what she never expected was this. The legend did not break him. It changed him. It tired him. It cost him, but it did not take everything. One evening, much later, when the house was quieter than usual, and the years of constant noise finally felt distant, she found him sitting not in front of awards, not near the piano, not surrounded by reminders of triumph, but simply in an ordinary chair in an ordinary room, with no audience, no cameras, no expectations waiting outside the door. He looked peaceful, not triumphant, not burdened, just present. It startled her. For so long she had watched him balancing between myth and man, between applause and silence, between being eternal for the world and human for himself. She had grown used to the tension, the careful posture, the invisible calculations that followed him everywhere. But in that moment, there was no calculation, only stillness. "You're quiet tonight," she said softly. He smiled, not the practiced smile the world adored, but a smaller, easier one that felt completely real. "I've been thinking," he replied. "About what?" she asked. He paused before answering, as if choosing honesty over performance for once. "About how strange it is," he said, "that people think a legend is something you become, when really it's something you slowly learn to carry." The words didn't sound sad, they sounded accepted. And that changed everything. For years, she had feared that the legend was stealing pieces of him, that every success, every expectation, every demand for perfection was slowly replacing the person she knew with an untouchable symbol the world insisted on preserving. She thought the crown was a trap he could never escape. But now she realized the truth was more complicated. He had never fully belonged to the legend. He had simply learned how to live beside it. The world saw only the shining figure, the eternal icon, the myth that could never grow old. But in private, in quiet rooms like this one, he had continued to exist as something far more fragile and far more real. A father who worried, a man who reflected, a human being who sometimes felt tired, yet still chose to keep giving, because giving had become part of who he was. The cost had been real. The loneliness had been real. The weight had absolutely been real. But so had the love that remained underneath it all. She sat across from him, studying his face carefully, noticing something she had overlooked for years. Yes, there were signs of exhaustion.
Yes, there were traces of the long journey written subtly into his expression. But there was also something else now, something steadier than before. Acceptance. Not the kind that comes from defeat, but the kind that comes from understanding the full truth of one's life and choosing anyway to keep moving forward. I used to think the legend was taking you away from me, she admitted quietly. He looked at her with gentle surprise. And now? He asked. She hesitated, searching for the right words, then spoke with a certainty she hadn't possessed before. Now I think you were never really gone, she said. You were just carrying something too big for anyone else to see. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was calm, complete, almost peaceful. For the first time, she understood the ending no one else would expect. The story was never about a man being consumed by his own legend. It was about a man learning how to live with it, imperfectly, painfully, but honestly. The world would always remember the performances, the lights, the unstoppable energy that defined him in public. They would replay the songs, celebrate the triumphs, repeat the myth again and again, until it felt permanent. To them, the legend would remain flawless and eternal, frozen in its brightest moments. But she would remember something different. She would remember the quiet nights, the unfinished melodies, the thoughtful pauses, the rare smiles that arrived without effort. She would remember the man who sometimes sat in silence, not because he was lost, but because he was searching for a way to remain human in something larger than himself. And that memory would outlive every headline. Years later, when the world spoke about him as though he had been nothing but unstoppable brilliance, she would carry a more complete truth. Not a darker truth, not a tragic truth, just a fuller one. He had built a legend, yes, and he had paid a price for it, yes, but he had never fully disappeared inside it. The ending, she realized, was not the loss everyone feared. It was the quiet revelation that legends are not prisons unless the person inside them forgets who they were before the world started watching. He never forgot. Even at his most burdened, even at his most exhausted, even when expectations felt endless and permanence felt heavy, he still returned, again and again, to those small private moments where he allowed himself to simply exist without performing. That was the part of the story no audience ever saw, and it was the part that mattered most. Because in the end, the crown did not stay on forever. Not really. It came off in quiet rooms, in late-night conversations, in soft piano notes played for no one but himself. And in those moments, the legend rested, while the man finally breathed. That was the truth she carried. Not that greatness destroyed him, not that fame erased him, but that behind the unstoppable icon the world worshipped, there remained a human being who felt deeply, loved quietly, and endured more than anyone realized, yet still chose, every single day, to keep giving the world the light it believed would never fade. The legend lived on, the music lived on, the myth lived on, but the ending was different than anyone expected, because what truly survived was not just the king the world remembered, but the man she never lost.